Doe Hawkins, kind of unexpected, but remember her and her family was a shock to them, I'm sure. And remember all of our homebound folks and ones in the nursing home. Just remember to pray for these folks as God brings them to your mind during the week and lift them up, and that's what sustains us through our problems. But it's good to have everybody here at this live stream in-person Sunday school class this morning. It's January 13th. Tomorrow is Valentine's Day. And I hope all you guys are prepared. Okay. It's February. I'm sorry. Yeah, you're right. Thanks, Danny. And but we're here at Clintwood Baptist Church this morning, and this is our fourth lesson in our series, How to Avoid Life's Pitfalls. And believe you me, life has pitfalls. If we've lived, we've had pitfalls, haven't we? Yeah. And so many can associate with the title of the lesson today because the pitfall of hard times. Generally speaking, most everybody has come through a rough time in their life somewhere along the way, and some worse than others. Some of it's self-inflicted too, and we have had hard times in certain areas of our life, and when life is not good or pleasant for us, as we have to find a way, the best thing is to trust God to see us through any crisis. If we'll trust in Him, He will never leave us or forsake us. He's the steady anchor in our life. And of course, the source of that is prayer and God's Word, and that's our connection with this. Life brings many challenges, as we have seen in the past 2 years here in our country and in the world and even in our area. Satan is using this COVID bug to cause panic and fear, and I will say it has worked. He's fooled us a lot, and I just want to throw this in, and I guess I'm not throwing it at anybody, but I'm just kind of disappointed that our churches haven't had a stronger response. We were at a ball game. Christian school was down in Kingsport Friday night. Huge church. And the guy I coached with, he said, "How many people do you think attend this church right now?" My guess was somewhere 400, 500. That's how big the church was. He said 50. I couldn't believe it. And we've seen what it's done to our church. It's pretty tough. So I just want people to really pray and ask God to the direction of what we need to do and how to get back serving what we need to do and get back into to the groove, if you will, and not. First thing I do is turn the news off. I've said that from the very beginning. I've done that, and it's worked for me. But there are medicines out there. They've scared us to death that will fix this thing, and but they call it horse medicine. And did you see the one that had discovered that medicine? He won a Nobel Peace Prize for it in 2015. And the reason they down it is because it wasn't for COVID. They call it it's off medicine that they prescribe for a therapeutic for other things. But he won a Nobel Peace Prize for it, and they're putting it down. and it works. I saw a doctor testify before the Senate committee. I may have mentioned this before, but I think it's worth mentioning again if I haven't. The group had treated over 6,000 patients with this horse medicine. They hadn't lost a single one. I think that's tremendous. So that all I'm saying is let's get to facts and not run with the fear. I would say that it's pretty good treatment if that's the case. So I think the church needs to wake up and trust God instead of trusting these doctors that we see are getting paid millions of dollars. And so it's interesting that these vaccine companies, Pfizer, all the others, guess what? They're exempt from the mandate. They don't have to have that. Does that tell you anything? The FDA, the NIH, the CDC, Congress, and all their staff are exempt from having to take the vaccine. Why? The question is why? Let's find out. Find out. Well, I said all along that I said all that just to say this, that this fear and panic is killing the churches. And folks are really scared. And we need to trust in God. And it's hurt our schools, our children. And it's a given fact that this virtual learning is not as good as in person. And it's way, way down. So, but it looks like to me that this is going to be normalized. And you're going to see a lot of this. They're doing it now, even for days, snow days. They're going virtual. They don't have to make them back up. So anyhow, we're going to go with fear. We're going instead of trusting God. I want to trust God instead of going with fear and panic. Okay. So really, there's no middle ground. But on top of this, financial difficulties also can bring hard times as folks lose their jobs or face reduced work hours. There's many things that can cause hard times. And I dare say that everybody that's listening to me somewhere along the way has had a hard time in their life, whether it be financial, spiritual, or even physical, health-wise, has had a hard time. But health concerns us with the fact that we have to pay for it now, don't we? We have such a large bill. It's unbelievable. My surgery was put off, and I guarantee I'm going to have to go through all the pre's again. So that's, to me, that's just a money deal and making more money. But the other hard times we have tense relationship with others. That can bring strains in our life. And I'm sure hard times can be good times too. A lot of times I look back and see some of the hard times, and boy, it taught me big lessons on what to do and what not to do. And so as you look back, you say, well, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was at the time, but I learned a lot through that. And that can be of a benefit as well. One thing that I found for myself is, and of course you can answer for yourself as well, I found myself drawing closer to God when things got kind of tight and hard. Didn't run away from him, and that's what he wants. He wants us to run to him. And that's what I found in my life. And it worked. Standing here where I'm at right now. Not that I've attained, but I'm still working on that part of it. But when hard times hit, run to him, not away from him. And don't blame him. Don't blame. Some people blame God and never get over that. And that's pitiful, isn't it? So God can see us through any circumstance, any. And that's sort of, that word any is sort of like all, isn't it? That means any. And so the lesson focuses on the great responsibility Joseph faced to lead Egypt through a time of crisis. And I do want to say this, that I don't think I have it written down anywhere else in the lesson. He actually was leading the whole world at that time out of the crisis, out of the drought. It wasn't a regional thing the way I read it over in there. It might have been regional in that area. I mean, but it was wide, a wide reaching drought. And so he was at least leading half the world through that drought. And that, I mean, you think about how big a responsibility that would be to do that. And so we will study and see some of the times of plenty could come to an end and famine would grip the land. And it did it pretty fast. Joseph sought God's wisdom, followed God's plan. He found God faithful once again, as he had been earlier in Joseph's life. Now, as we go through our lesson, ponder on the challenges we have faced in our lives and in the lives of people we know. Perhaps we've helped people through some crises in their lives and realized that, wow, God was there the whole time working. Sometimes we have to look to see that and be objective about it. And it's hard sometimes. Things happen and we wonder why. And I personally don't have the answer, but God is with us all through those. So ask yourselves, how do the challenges test our faith? And that's a good question, isn't it? The setting of our series is, the whole series is Genesis 37 through chapter 50. And we have seen how God has worked in Joseph's life to this point. And it's been miraculous, really, because God has communicated with Joseph, but it's been through dreams and not directly. Well, I guess that's direct, a dream is, but we don't consider that talking back and forth, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so we've seen that differently with some of the patriarchs before Abraham and Joseph's father Jacob. We've seen them directly talk with God. And this is a little bit different with Joseph. God has been with Joseph every step of the way. So far, we have seen that. He was in the pit. They didn't kill him. A couple of his brothers stood up, one of them in particular, Reuben, and said, "We don't need to kill him." And he appealed to his brothers' greed and said, "We can sell him and get some money." And so that's how he saved him from getting killed. And so after last week's lesson and the dream that the cupbearer and the baker, that came true, God worked through Joseph to put him in the position for this week's lesson. And what is a question, and I mentioned it last week, as far as that cupbearer, it seemed like about 2 years went by before the cupbearer even mentioned Joseph's situation. And to me, that's kind of incredible. The Bible doesn't fill that gap, and I don't want to speculate. I mean, we could do all kinds of speculations on it, but for some reason, he didn't mention it. And that's kind of always behooved me ever since I've read this story about Joseph. But evidently, there was a reason. And I don't know what that is, but it's interesting to me that it took 2 years. So after we've seen the dream, exactly what Joseph said came true. The cupbearer was put back to his former position, and then the baker was killed, just like Joseph said it would happen. And Of course, after that, the cupbearer forgot, the Bible says. I don't know. Maybe we could go back and do a word study of that word forgot and see what that means. I don't know. That would be something that I'll try to do this week. But that would be interesting. But 2 years later, Pharaoh had two dreams that troubled him greatly. And I spoke on this a little bit last week. When a king or a Pharaoh had a dream, he would consult all his astrologers, magicians, and he'd assemble them in the court and said, what do they mean? And they tried to, you tell us the dream and we'll tell you the interpretation. You know what I mean? That's a trick that they use. Same thing happened to Nebuchadnezzar, And Pharaoh consulted all these guys in his court to determine the meaning of the dream, but no one could help him. And we see that in chapter 41, verse 8. And at this time, the cupbearer stepped forward and told the Pharaoh, I have an idea. Now, this is just me, that he felt like maybe he had some friends there in the astrology court, and he was afraid they was going to get killed, and he decided he'd tell about Joseph. I don't know. That's just something to speculate on. And so he said, I know somebody that can interpret your dreams. And while he was in prison, he retold the story about the cupbearer and the baker. And everything Joseph said came true. And how Joseph had predicted correctly exactly what was going to happen. Joseph was brought before Pharaoh, listened to Pharaoh's dreams, and interpreted them for him. Isn't that something? And the way the Bible reads, Joseph didn't have to ponder it. God must have given him the answer right then. If y'all can go back and read that account, I'm not going to take the time to read those verses, but you can read it, and it looks like God gave it to him instantly. I don't know. I think that's the way it happened. Okay. So on the interpretation of them, Pharaoh gave Joseph the job of executing the plan Joseph had suggested when he interpreted the dreams for Pharaoh. And he actually says, if you go back and read, that he had two dreams, but he said they're saying the same thing. And what that means is, once God gives it twice to you, it's going to happen. Nothing is going to change it. It's what we would call etching it in stone. And the dreams is going to come true, and there's nothing they can do about it. And so now this brings us to our first point in our lesson, and that is seek God's wisdom. And we're in Genesis 41, and we're going to read verse 28. This is a thing which I have spoken unto Pharaoh. What God is about to do, he showeth unto Pharaoh. The first thing I'd like to say is that it's interesting that, nothing intimidates God. People can get intimidated. Little children can get intimidated with, say, just a ball player. We go down to play a ball game. We've got two seventh graders and an eighth grader starting against a varsity team that's got 5 seniors. That's intimidation, isn't it? Anything can intimidate you, but nothing intimidates God. Nothing can intimidate him. And it says here that which I have spoken unto Pharaoh, this refers back to verses 25 and 27, and I'll not read them just for the sake of time, where he had told Pharaoh the king's two dreams essentially was one and the same, as I mentioned there before. And he pointed him to the fact that God was going to bring this about. It was coming. There wasn't nothing he could do about it, so you better get prepared. Okay? And so that's just like you and I. When we have a deadline, it's coming. Sometimes we can finagle and put the deadline off, but this deadline you can't put off. It's coming. God has said it's going to happen. So in verse 29, we see, behold, there comes 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. Now, this is interesting because Egypt depended, and we all know the Nile River is a central river there in Egypt that would flood over. And matter of fact, most people say it lasts about 4 months on a normal year. And that water would come over the banks of the Nile and mix with the sand, and it would be real fertile and rich, and they could grow all their grain and everything to sustain their life. And that's how they made it. That's why the Nile was it's such an important river to the nation of Egypt. And it was necessary for their agricultural system. This made the sand workable, and it made it produce just abundant stuff. And so then the phrase throughout the land of Egypt would refer to the land along the Nile. And that would, yeah, and really basically our farmland here in the United States would be what we would call in the midland or through Illinois and out that way, Kansas and all the middle America. And basically the same. And guess what goes through there? Mississippi. See? So it was very fertile as well. So in verse 30 it says, and there shall arise after them 7 years of famine, and all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land. So there's going to be 7 years here that is going to just produce over and abundant all the things that they need to sustain their life. And if you will go back and read that, you'll find that God instructed them to save 1/5 of everything they grew. And you wonder, I don't know if you all have ever looked into a Bible dictionary or not, but I have seen they have grain. We always think that storage buildings or anything like that would be up above ground. They would dig in that area down below ground, and that's where they would put their grain. Okay, it's such an arid place that it wouldn't spoil, it wouldn't mold, and all that. And they would have, from what I've seen, now these are huge. I'm not going to give a dimension because I'm not sure how big they are, but they just dig big holes in the ground, and they build steps or inclines that would spiral right down. They were mostly round, the ones I've seen, and I'm sure they could build them square if they wanted to. But the ones I have seen in the pictures, they would spiral down all the way down to the bottom, and that's where they would put their grain and store it. And if you put that in your mind, that could be stored there for a long time. Okay, and if it didn't have any rain, there would be nothing to spoil it. And so that's interesting of how they stored it. So that's how they stored their grain. And after the abundance of 7 years, that represented, if you go back and read the lesson, you saw 7 fat cows. That was the abundant years. And then you saw 7 skinny cows, and that was the lean years. Okay? And then you saw the worthless heads of grain in the drought time, but there was good heads of grain in the plenty time. Okay? And the thing that I want to point out is that the Bible uses the word that explains the drought as being extreme. And extreme means it's very, very harsh. And the famine would come because the annual rain would stop. There would be nothing that could give nutrients to the grains to grow them again. So Joseph declared that the famine would be so bad, all the plenty would be forgotten here in that verse I just read. It's going to be so bad you forget how good it was. And he even states that this famine would devastate the land. And in verse 31 it says, "And the plenty shall not be known in the land by reason of that famine following, for it shall be very grievous." The thing that we need to look at here, the disastrous years of the famine would erase people's memory. That's what we don't catch when we read this, of how abundant the years they had enjoyed just a short time before. They forgot about it, how good it was. And the thing about that is that memory would only make the pain more severe. That's what that word grievous means. And he says that in verse 32, "And for that dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice, it is because the thing is established by God," as I mentioned before. And God will shortly bring it to pass. I guess what this means here, the way I take it, and I think it's the right interpretation, that both these dreams were the same, and that when that time of plenty would end, they were definitely going to be straight into a famine, and it was going to be bad. And it was established, and nothing's going to change it. God used two different dreams here, and to teach the same thing. And I would say that really buffaloed the Pharaoh trying to figure out what they were. And so Joseph come along and explained it and cleared it up. And what's interesting to me, Pharaoh certainly understood from Joseph's words that Joseph's God was guiding the coming events. What if he didn't? He wasn't in God's plan. But you speculate that here is a pagan and he's believing in the God of Abraham. It's kind of odd, isn't it? It is. It is. But I think in my wondering, my pondering, is that Joseph demonstrated in his life to the Pharaoh along the way that there was a God of the universe. And I think you saw that in Joseph. I think we overlooked that as we studied Joseph's life. But Joseph had an idea, and it came through God, that Pharaoh appoint a wise individual to oversee the gathering of the surplus food during the food years so that the Egyptians would not starve during the years of famine. That seemed reasonable, didn't it? Sure. So guess what? This tells us that even the unsaved Pharaoh recognizes God's Spirit. And that Spirit was on Joseph. And you know what? I don't think he was a dummy either. Put the guy that come up with the plan that God was speaking through, put him in charge. Pharaoh did. And he had ministered the gathering of the harvest through this time. We all need to seek God's wisdom when we face challenges. Never try to do it on our own. Sometimes, now, I'm guilty, have been over the years. First thing I'll do is try to work it out. First thing we should do is pray. Okay? And then the workout comes easier later. When God reveals to us, somebody will ask me a question. It'd be a hard question. How are we going to handle this? And So, I have learned. Now, years ago, I would say this is what we're going to handle. But I have learned. Give me a little while. Let me pray about it, and we'll see. And not that I'm a great philosopher or anything like that. Okay, I've just learned that through the hard knocks. Okay, trying to do it. I learned a long time ago not to work on Sunday because you'd give it back during the week. And they say, well, you can work when your ox is in the ditch. Yeah, sometimes we put these oxes in the ditch on our own and try to get them out. So, generally speaking, over the years, every time I would call work on Sunday, you'd give that time back during the week. And so, never had. Now, sometimes you have to. I mean, if there's things that pressing and you got water rising and things like that, you have to take care of things. But let's not put the ox in the ditch yourself, and then make up something to get him out. It's important. But here's an unsafe Pharaoh that recognizes God's spirit on Joseph. I think that's big. I think that's very important. And that tells us that Joseph had a tremendous testimony. And he was what we would call an example of a good Christian. And this Pharaoh recognized it. God has promised to hear us when we call. So when we have difficult times in our life, you can go to 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7, or 1 John chapter 5, verses 14 and 15. And God has promised if we come to him, he'll help us. That's quite a promise, isn't it? So our second point of our lesson is follow God's plan. God gave this plan to Joseph. Joseph passed it along to Pharaoh. And old Pharaoh, he's a pretty smart guy. He said, Joseph, you're the man who's going to bring us through. Joseph now needed to execute that plan and that God had given him. And he passed it along to the Pharaoh. So in verse 47 of 41, it says, and in the 7 plenteous years, the earth brought forth by the handfuls. I don't know about you, but I like that during those 7 bountiful years, I like that word handfuls. The word handful designates an abundance of grain. And to me, I can just see people going down the street, just reaching down and getting a handful. That's my vision of handfuls. And they just had an abundance during that time. And so they were just scooping it up. Times of plenty also can be times of challenge as well. Have you all ever thought of it that way? When God gives you an abundance, what are you going to do with it? You don't want to let it ruin whatever it is. If it's money, if it's land, if it's crops. I know Skip. He said, "Boy, I've got these tomatoes. I don't want them to go to waste." That's a very small example, but you magnify that, and you see these people playing the lottery. They can't handle the abundance, and it's pitiful, isn't it? And so that's something that Christians need to do. When God gives us handfuls, we need to share it. We need to ask God's guidance on what to do with it. And we need to be good stewards with what he has blessed us with. Joseph's plan, which was God's plan, okay, focused on saving from the plentiful years to cover the lean years. Now, this is something that we you don't focus on unless you read through real carefully. But we give Joseph credit for gathering all this grain, but he had to have help. In every city, it says, in every region, they had to store this grain. So he couldn't do all that by himself. So he had good people that would step up and help him and do all the work. He just supervised it, okay? Now, he was second in command in that land at that time. When they went on the motorcade, he was in the second chariot. Perhaps he might have even been riding with Pharaoh at times. So he was a very high official in that land. And so, but don't forget that handfuls. I think that is just a beautiful explanation of how plenteous the grain was during that time. And in verse 48, it says, and he gathered up all the food for 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. See, it's multiple places. The food of the field, which was round about every city, laid he up in the same place. He would gather it to the city, and they'd have a central place where they could come and get it. Okay? And we're going to see that God's plan, as you read this, you don't get it until the end on how big the plan, how much the plan covered. But it was big, okay? And so that plan, if you'll read, you can go back to 41 and read in the first part of the chapter and see that they would save 1/5 of it and put it back. And that was part of the plan. So as the verse indicates, this was done in every city in Egypt and outside the cities in each community to service the particular area where they lived and where it would be take care of all the folks there. Just really a great plan when you think about it. And only God can come up with those type of things that make them work. So in verse 49, it says, and Joseph gathered corn as the sand of the sea, very much, until he left numbering, for it was without number. He couldn't even count it, how much they had. You talk about blessing, handfuls. That's unbelievable, isn't it?
Beyond measure.
Beyond measure. Yep. So when it says Joseph gathered, it simply means he was overseeing, and I pointed that out before. But God pointed out a blessing greater than what they could imagine. He just poured it out. And you know what? When something happens in our life, we say, man, I didn't imagine it was going to be that good. God always operates that way. He makes it better than what we even ask for or expect. And I think it's great. So the third part of our lesson here is be fruitful even in famine. And in verse 50 it says, and unto Joseph was born 2 sons before the years of famine came, which as Nath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bare unto him. Now, as far as I know, and as far as I can read, just because they had similar names, Potiphar that had bought Joseph before was not any relation to this Potipharah. Potipharah was a priest, and the worship center in On was to the sun god Ra. And you say, God is blessing these heathens, but he's got a purpose, and that's going to come in the next few lessons, and we'll see what his purpose is. But notice that he had 2 sons. This woman gave him 2 sons, and Joseph's 2 sons here was in verse 51. And Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God said, he hath made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. This is very interesting, and I studied on this particular verse a long time. God seems to be saying here that Joseph was not going back to the land. And not that he wasn't a Hebrew or forget about who he was, but it's sort of like his salvation. I know that it's in a pagan land, but this is just me. That God takes away all the bad stuff, all of his previous life, and he blesses him with a son that makes him forget all that. And what happens to us when we become saved? God gives us a new memory. Not that it didn't happen, but he blesses us and gives us the ability to forget what we was before. Isn't that marvelous? And we have a picture of Joseph here, and we can even go the parallels of Joseph and Jesus is something else. If you just identify all the parallels between Joseph and Jesus. And then his second son could be said that I read a commentator, and he said his name here was Ephraim, and in verse 52, and the name of the second called Ephraim, for God hath caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. One of the guys said that Manasseh should have been amnesia because he made him forget, and then Ephraim should be he won the lottery. But I don't know if that adequately says that or not. But the important thing to remember is that in 50, let's see, that was 52, and 53, and the 7 years of plenteous that was in the land of Egypt were ended. And I wanted to point this out, and we'll end our lesson. And the 7 years of dearth began to come, according as Joseph had said, and the dearth, that's the drought, was in all the land, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. The drought was coming, but Egypt was okay. And Joseph, through God's plan, had made that possible. So the main thing is God's in control. Remember that. And he will take care of us. Let's trust him this day. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you right now. Be with us as we go to our morning worship hour. Be with the pastor as he brings a message. And thank you so much for each individual that looks into your word. Bless us, we pray.